Now that we have learned about the commitments of feminist ethics and how feminist philosophers have a shared focus on power, gender, oppression, and privilege in our ethical and moral theorizing, it is time to talk about one of the earliest approaches to feminist ethics, which is care ethics. So just like the terms feminism and feminist philosophy resist generalizations and categorizations and even tight definitions, it would be more productive to talk about care here as a value and practice. We have to notice in this lecture that we talk about care as a value and as practice. Care ethics is generally described as, in the words of feminist philosopher Virginia Held, a mosaic of insights and value, the way it is sensitive to contextual nuance and particular narratives, rather than the making of the abstract and universal claims of more familiar moral theories. So what is this ethics of care or care ethics, and how do they reconceptualize our moral problems in the perspective of care? Moral psychologist Carol Gilligan's groundbreaking work contributed to the advancement of feminist ethical thinking. So in her book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, written in 1982, she examined how women's moral development may be different from men's, and how the traditional ethical theories do not account for this difference. So Gilligan's study led her to conclude that women's morality centers on the notions of caring and responsibility. In her work, Gilligan empirically demonstrated how men and women think differently in approaching ethical issues. So this follows from the findings of the psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, who proposed 6 stages of moral development from childhood to adulthood. So Kohlberg was saying that the individual conceives right through 6 stages. The first one being they are obeying authority and avoiding punishment. The second, they satisfy one's own desires and let others do the same through fair exchanges. The third is on cultivating one's relationships and performing the duties of one's social roles. Fourth, obeying the law and maintaining the welfare of the group. Fifth, upholding the basic rights and values of one's society. And lastly, is abiding by abstract universal moral principles. So in this study, it has been concluded that women rarely pass beyond lower stages and men can advance faster. Well, Gilligan's objection consisted of her own empirical findings, and she found out, well, Kohlberg's proposal may not be accurate at all. Gilligan's research revealed that women's experiences in these circumstances, it has a different focus. So the process of thinking about our moral issues, moral problems, it has an impact on the relationships that we have and the caring relationship attached to them. Unlike men, women are more likely to act on moral decisions on the basis of feelings of love and compassion. While men, on the other hand, they tend to base their moral choices on the application of abstract moral rules. She then suggested that women's basic moral orientation is one of caring. That is, of course, taking care of others in a personal way. Men's primary values are equality, and this follows the morality of justice that we have identified as a characteristic of a traditional male way of doing ethics. Whereas for women, their values are care, inclusion, and protection from harm. Gilligan noted that women's moral weakness manifests in an apparent diffusion and confusion of judgment is thus inseparable from women's moral strength, an overriding concern with relationships and responsibilities. So in here, we can see that in terms of moral dilemmas, women see this as just conflicts of responsibilities and not of rights. Ethics of care, then, is based on the concepts of voice, connectedness, interdependence, and relationships. So many feminists built on the work of Carol Gilligan and made use of this opportunity to develop new lines of inquiry in ethics. So we have here Nell Noddings, also a feminist advocate of ethics of care. So Nell Noddings demonstrated a version of ethics of care that heavily revolves around human caring and the memory of caring and being cared for. So in her book titled Caring, A Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education, Noddings believed that women's moral reasoning is entirely different from that of men's. So in this sense, ethics must be viewed as these people are relational, are interdependent, and we emphasize on relationships. She also emphasized that the true form of care happens in an active personal encounter rather than just pure good intentions. So on the issue of making ethical judgments involving ethics of care, Noddings asserted that the task is primarily not focused on judgment, but on heightening one's moral sensitivity and perception. So in this sense, we can say that ethics of care recognizes the general principles and rules are of little help in evaluating the rightness of an act. So every person has a particular context that must be considered in moral evaluation. Simply put, we don't follow a certain rule or maxim, but rather we respond and attend to the good and needs of people with whom we have relationships. Well, due to the richness of this theoretical paradigm, it eventually led to various conceptual innovations based on care perspective. We can look at the work of Sarah Ruddick. Sarah built on the care perspective in developing accounts of mothering, motherhood, and peace ethic. Sarah Ruddick focused on what is supposedly a moral and political neglect of society's most vulnerable, such as children and mothers. So for Ruddick, these practices help us inform a nonviolent approach to solving these moral problems. Joan Tronto, on the other hand, focused more on the general significance of care ethics, especially in the political space. She argued for the revaluation of care work as one of the ways to flourish and better societies. Care work must be recognized in political and social spaces, especially in accounts of justice and citizenship. Tronto, along with Virginia Held, also emphasized the value of care in their works and philosophizing. Lastly, we have Eva Kitay. She emphasized the concept of dependency, which is the feature of all caring relationships. She proposes that accounts and theories of morality and justice, they must take into account the reality of human dependency. Furthermore, she asserts that the capacity to care should be a moral power. While feminist philosopher Virginia Held described ethics of care as one that has the potential to substitute existing moral theories, she stated that this approach works on the emphasis of some of the neglected moral considerations, integrating and reconceptualizing them, especially those that are associated with care and justice. So of course, feminists won't like these categorizations and tight definitions, but they agree on some core values and commitments and features of the care of ethics approach. The central features include, first, the focus on the moral salience of attending to and meeting the needs of people with whom we take responsibility. We can see here the emphasis on the reality of human dependency, that humans are connected, interconnected, and dependent on each other. Second, ethics of care, unlike traditional ethical theories, values emotion. Emotions such as sympathy, empathy, sensitivity, and responsiveness are considered significant in this approach. We know and we have learned in philosophy and in traditional ethics that they don't value emotions, that they reject emotions, and that we only look at rationality, faculty of reason, to be a determinant or to be one that can be influential in our ethical decision making. But here in ethics of care, they recognize the role of emotions and the relational capabilities we have, especially in ethical decision making. Third, in contrast to other moral theories that seek impartiality through universal and abstract rules, ethics of care respect the diversity of claims of others whom we share actual relationships with. Lastly, as other feminists advocate for, ethics of care attempts to reconceptualize the notion of the public and the private. So in general, we can see that ethics of care sees people as relational and interdependent rather than self-sufficient individuals. Although for a time, ethics of care has been the dominant approach to feminist ethics, it is not without criticisms. Some feminists argue that this approach romanticizes or valorizes women's capacity for caring and care work, which all the more contributes to the oppression of women. One is the tendency for exploitation of caregivers, and the other is the pluralism of many women's experiences, such that the excessive valuation of care may also lead to neglect of instances of women's capacities to do harm. Another is that while it is feminine, it is not necessarily feminist, such that this caring and nurturer role has various moral limitations. And there's this concern too, that since it is not equipped to deal with strangers and the focus is on small-scale situations or personal relationships, some wonder if the care perspective is even adequate to address moral, social, and political problems rooted in structures. Nonetheless, feminist ethics of care has been influential in various fields, such as gender studies, education, medicine, and counseling. Some criticisms against this approach include issues of femininity, women empowerment, and underappreciation of ethics of justice. But all the more, we must know that feminists continue to campaign for approaches to formulating a moral theory that is inclusive and cognizant of individual differences.